All right, we are going to jump into assembling Teak the Turkey. He's got several parts, but I promise it's not as difficult as it looks. We're going to go through putting him all together step by step. All right, I will meet you back in just a moment. I'll tell you about the supplies. All right, so all you're going to need to assemble Teak is some sewing pins, or in this case, I use these long quilting pins. I find that they hold up a little bit better. A tapestry needle, and some scissors. All right, let's get started. All right, so if you're following the pattern, Teak has been finished, the head and the body. On my sample, I didn't put eyes because I'm going to embroider these later, but with yours, you would have the safety eyes or embroidery, whatever you'd prefer. So we're going to sew on his beak first, and it's important to know that the decreases in the beak mark the top. So you see that the diagonal is a lot steeper. I'm sorry, it's less steep here. And so that's going to be the top of the beak, and you would pin it about on the center of the face, just slightly down. Let's see how this looks. Alright, so I always like double, triple check that I like the placement before I ever sew anything on. So if we're looking at him straight on, that looks pretty good. This is right around, this is about row 7. Looks pretty good from the side. I think I'm going to shift the beak just a little bit. It feels slightly off center. Alright, that's probably good. Okay, so next I am going to thread my yarn onto my tapestry needle. Alright, and for those of you who have had questions about sewing body parts or limbs or anything to a fully stuffed piece, this is the method that I use, but you can do whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. Alright. So using the yarn tail left over from the beak as directed in the pattern, I'm going to first go under this closest stitch. And then I usually hold the yarn back so that it doesn't get tangled, but I go from the top in down into the stitch when I'm sewing. I've seen other people work it slightly differently. Like I said, it's a personal preference. And then as you continue on, just go into the next stitch of the head. And as you're sewing, if your beak feels a little like, I don't know, less full, you can add, I would recommend sewing like 2/3 of the way around and then adding stuffing because it's easier to manipulate. Alright, I am going to finish sewing this beak on, and I'll come back and show you how we're going to put the feet on the bottom of our Teak. Alright, so here's what Teak looks like with his beak sewed on, and we are going to move on to the feet. So I did mine the same color as the beak for this particular sample. So, alright. It's easier if you hold Teak like head down and then place the feet with this last row worked towards the tail. And if you did go with the option to add marbles to balance him, make sure that Teak can like sit up on his own, or if he leans forward slightly, then don't worry about it because the tail feathers will balance him out. So you can shift these forward slightly or back depending on how he sits. All right, so we generally want to pin them like that, but I'm going to double check. Yeah, those are very off center. Okay, I'm going to fix this one. I generally use the where I sewed the body closed as like a center line. And if you happen to have worked my Sir Duckington pattern, the feet are almost identical to this pattern. And they're placed in pretty much the same way. Alright, so looking straightforward, that looks better, but I think I'm gonna shift this one back just a little bit. Oop. Okay, let's see how he sits without me messing it up. Alright, so mine is sitting pretty flat. Alright, so I'm not terribly worried about him toppling over. And if you look at him from the side, like I said, make sure he can balance sitting up. So your feet might be slightly farther forward, they might be a teeny bit further back, but I wouldn't go further back than probably right here where the top of the foot kind of lines up with the face. Alright, so then to sew them on, we're going to use the longer of the tail. Oh, I'm sorry, just this one tail. Forgot I weaved the other one in already. Alright, and when you're sewing on the legs, only sew this last row to the body. We're not sewing the rest of the foot or anything. And the reason for that is mostly because you can like change the position of the feet slightly, so that if you need to have it let it be a little wider so it doesn't topple over, then you can do that. If you just sew them completely to the body, which I mean I guess you can, but I like a little bit more movement in mine. Okay, so I always start with, let me zoom in just a little. So I'm going to start by sewing this top row of stitches to the body, and then I'll remove my pins and sew the bottom row to the body. So last time with the beak, I went directly into the body. This time I'm actually going to go into this top stitch first, and I'll go under the front loop only. Then I'm going to go down and go into the stitch on the body. Front loop only. And you'll see why we're doing the front loop only in just a moment. Oops, see, got tail from the other foot caught. Alright, so one last stitch on this side. Alright, I'm going to remove my pins. Work into the body. Alright, so your foot should look kind of like this. And now what we're going to do is we're going to sew this side down. So you can shift it however is more comfortable for you. And I work into the front loop only on this side as well. we're going to fasten off. Oops. And then I'm going to weave the rest of the tail out through another part of the body. And snip. So now you can, I know it's going to flop up a little bit, but when he sits down, the foot is going to be sitting like this. All right, so I will meet you back as soon as I'm done sewing this other foot on, and we will move on to the wings. All right, so I've got an important note about placing Teak's wings. These back loop, or the unworked loops right here, are going to be placement for the tail feathers. And we're not going to use every single row, but you can if you want to. But here, when you place the wing, if you can see the ridges of the unworked loops, the wing will cover a few of them, but you want to angle the wings slightly downward so that they're not really covering these rows of unworked loops, because we're going to sew the tail feathers on there later. So if it covers one or two, like, don't worry about it, but you want to try and angle the tip of your wing down towards like the feet. You can see that. All right, I'm going to pin these in place and I'll be right back so we can start sewing them on. All right, we've got Teak's wings pinned in place, and when we go to sew, we're only going to be sewing this front edge right here. I have it pinned just to keep the wing out of the way, but we're only going to be sewing this part to the body, not the entire wing. Although I suppose you could, but it may get in the way of doing the tail feathers later. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm using the long tail from the very last row worked on the wing. This short tail from the starting chain we'll weave in just a little bit. Alright, so I'm going to go, as before, directly into the body first. And then top down into the wing. Alright, I'm just about done going up the side of this wing, and I will stop right here, and then I'm going to finish up the rest of this and this other wing, and I will meet you back so that we can start pinning the tail feathers. Alright, so the wings are sewed on, and you should have 5 of these large tail feathers. You can do more if you like, but if you're following the pattern, you just need 5, and we are only going to use 3 for the back row, so we're going to set 2 of these aside. Alright, so we are going to be pinning the feathers along this very last row of unworked stitches. So what I like to do is fold the wings out of the way a little bit, and we're going to weave all these tails directly into the body. We're not going to worry about weaving them into the feathers, although you can do that. It just takes a little bit more work. So starting on whichever side you prefer, I'm going to hold my wing in place, or I'm sorry, the tail feather. And I'm going to line up the very last unworked stitch with the last row I worked in white right here. So I'm just going to pin this bottom edge. Okay, and then we're going to do the exact same thing with the next tail feather. All right, and the remaining one. And now, like I said before, if your tail feather goes slightly past the last unworked loop, it's not that big of a deal. They're just meant to be a guide. Okay. So I'm gonna flip these up so you can kind of see. So if you're looking at Teak straight on, back the camera up a little bit. These tail feathers should have the center one almost directly behind the head, and then the two on the sides. All right, so next we're going to grab our color B, which was the brown body color, and just cut a pretty long length. We're going to use this one length to sew all of the 3 tail feathers to the last row. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these on first, but you are welcome to weave these in first, whichever you'd prefer. I'm going to go ahead and meet you back once I've sewed it on, and then I'll show you quickly how I weave the rest of these in, and I'll be right back. Fast, I completely forgot to mention. Okay, so when we're going through to sew these on, what I do is I actually start working into the body at first, but I go under that unworked loop, and then I go through the final stitch the bottom edge of these stitches along the tail feathers. And I work that way, going under the loop on the body, back into the tail feather, under the loop on the body, back into the tail feather. I hope that makes sense, and I will finish sewing these on. I'll be right back. All right, so we've got Teak's feathers, the back row of tail feathers sewn on. So now what we need to do is get rid of all these excess yarn tails, and instead of weaving them into the feathers, because that'll take quite a while, what you can do is just weave them directly down into the body and cut the excess. And do that with each yarn tail all the way across. Keeping as close to the base where the tail feather meets the body as possible. And we'll be repeating this exact same process with all the rows of the tail feathers. I will finish up weaving in these ends, and then I'll show you quickly how to pin the second row of tail feathers, and we'll go from there. We've got all of our ends woven in. We're going to move on to the second row of tail feathers. So what I do is I fold these down out of the way. And the reason I started with the last row first was because it was easier to fold the tail feathers down and back than to try and fold them forward into the neck to work on the rows behind. But if you find this is more difficult, go ahead and work the other way. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever is more comfortable. Okay, so just as we did with the previous row, we're going to pin the last set of large tail feathers to this next row of unworked back loops, and we're going to stagger them. So instead of starting all the way over here where they start, we're going to position the tail feathers so that they are in between the two on the back, if that makes sense. So center those as much as you can. All right, and then the last tail feather. Centered between those two. All right, so my testers did notice a tendency to have the feathers bunch if you work in the same direction. So I started on this side to work across to sew this final row of tail feathers. It might be better to start on the opposite side as indicated in the pattern and start from here and work this way to keep your feathers from bunching up on one side. So just as before, I'm going to get a long length of color B, the brown body color, and I'm going to go into the first back loop to start, leaving enough of a tail that I can tie this off later. And then I'll go into the feather. Oh. Apparently that stitch is tighter than I thought. There we go. Okay. All right. Then from going under, we're going to go into the next back loop. And back into the tail feather. All right, I'm going to repeat this all the way across and then weave in my ends, and I'll show you how to position the final row of tail feathers, and then we'll just have to sew the little wattle on and we'll be done. And now that we've got the second row all sewn on and all the ends woven in, we're going to move on to the third row. We'll repeat the exact same process. We're going to fold these feathers down, back out of the way, and then we're going to attach the small tail feathers to this very next row of unworked back loops. So just as we did the first row right here, we're going to position these three in the exact same manner, one on the side, one in the center, and one on the other side. Okay, there is the first one. Actually, I think I'll move it over just a bit. And the final feather. All right, so I'm going to use another long length of color B. And repeat the exact same process. And as I was talking about, to keep your feathers from bunching up, because I started on this side, I'm going to start on this side now and work my way across. All right, I'll meet you guys back, and then all we have to do is sew the wattle on. And this is the result when you get all 3 rows of feathers sewn on. Now I crochet very tightly. My tension is very, very tight. And so my feathers are pretty stiff and they tend to stay up on their own. If you're noticing that yours are a little bit loose or floppy, you can do a little bit of starch or another fabric stiffener on the feathers just to keep them standing upright, depending on what you're making teak for. If it's just for decoration, I would say go ahead and use the starch. All right, so let's jump into the very last part. We're going to attach, the wattle right under Teak's beak and onto his neck. Now this will look a little different from the one in the pattern. The one in the pattern, I just used a single color. With this one, I wanted to try and do kind of an ombre effect because I had extra yarn. You don't have to do this. I was just sort of experimenting with this one. All right, so when you make the wattle, it starts with a magic ring at the bottom, and then you crochet upward in the round until you get to this flat part. You want to make sure that your ring, this is like where the open circle is, this is going to face the body, so it's the back side. You want the flat, unbroken side to be your front. So with that in mind, I'm going to pin this in the center of the neck, directly underneath the beak. So you want this last row to be flush with the beak. All right, and just to hold it in place, I'm going to put a pin right there. Okay, so we're only going to sew this flat portion. The rest of this will be left loose. So you can see here where I've sewn it on already. So only the flat part is sewed to the bottom, like the chin area, and then this little ball portion is loose. All right, so we're going to use the excess yarn tail from when we made the wattle. And just as we did before, I like to start by going into the main body first, or in this case, the head. And you can either go under only the front loop or both loops, whichever is your personal preference. I'm going under the front loop because it makes a little bit of a tighter seam along this bottom edge. And now as you're working down, you would go into the sides of these rows. Now remove that pin, it's getting in my way. Okay. Just make sure to keep it as centered as possible. All right, and we're coming to the bottom where it starts to form into a ring. So I am going to kind of fold this up a little bit so that I can crochet the underside. I'm sorry, not crochet. I can sew the underside of the wattle. And then we're going to go back up the other side. We're just about done here. All right, and I am going to tie off. Pulling pretty tight, and then I will weave the remaining tail up through the head and snip. All right, and my Teak the turkey is just missing some eyes, but otherwise he is done. I hope you guys like this tutorial, and if you enjoyed it, make sure you hit like. I know this video is private, but I may be doing some more public videos in the future, and I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you later.